running a marathon will not wear out your joints. The next bit, but will improve them, I realise, is a brave title to a room full of sports scientists, physicians, physical therapists, and many of you are marathon runners. I'm an orthopaedic surgeon, I'm a runner, I'm a researcher. I'm grateful to these funders. I think in this talk there's something for everybody, whether you are a couch potato, a marathon runner, or an Ironman or Ironwoman. The term couch potato, by the way, is not my term. It's the NHS Couch to 5K app term to recruit those people who are not runners to their app. And I did a couch to 5K study, and it's self-confessed couch potatoes. So don't blame me for labelling people as couch potatoes. What am I going to tell you? Well, I'm going to tell you how orthopaedic surgeons view physical activity and physical inactivity. I'm going to take you through how I got involved in this subject, what happens to your body as you exercise, the published medical evidence of spine, hip, and knee joints responding to marathon running, and the future for this subject, and then conclude with what I think you'll take home is that exercise damages joints is a misbelief, and we should no longer be using the term wear and tear arthritis to describe arthritis. And if you're not a runner at the moment, then I'll give you some evidence-based guidelines on how to take it up. So, how do orthopaedic surgeons view physical activity? Well, there's one simple word for the whole slide, it's movement. We know if you break your bone, if you don't move the bone ends, it won't heal. If you do move them too much, they won't heal either. We know when we operate on patients' joints and they don't move them, they become stiff. We know that when they experience pain after surgery, physical therapy is absolutely essential to move the joint, which actually helps them out of pain. We know that muscle pain, such as delayed onset muscle soreness, 48 hours at its maximum after exercise, is made better by doing more. We know that if you don't use the muscle, it will waste away. And we know that if you stay in bed as an elderly person, it will kill you. I've been moving all my life, whether it's on a bike, up mountains, kayaks, snow, any surface. And then, age 42, one of my friends said, it's about time you did some proper exercise. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's got to hurt, and it can't be fun. So I've entered you for the New York Marathon. I wasn't a big runner, but we all do a bit of running in training for sport. Well, for 2 weeks afterwards, I hobbled around the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital, which is the largest orthopaedic hospital in Europe, and that's where I work, and all my colleagues said, well, that's because you ran a marathon. Well, that got me really interested. So what happens to your body when you exercise? Well, let's just pause. What happens to a car when you use it? The more you drive a car, the more the moving parts are worn. What happens to a human? Well, the more a human exercises, the more the muscles become well coordinated. This actually helps spread the load across the cartilage surfaces. The more you exercise, the more your bones improve. They get stronger. The more you exercise, the more anti-inflammatory myokines, good guys, are released from the muscle. The more you exercise, the more you lose abdominal fat. I'm not saying you actually lose weight necessarily, but you lose abdominal fat, and this reduces the bad guys, the adipokines. So it's not like a car where you just simply wear yourself out. Well, that got me into it and changed the direction of my research team. And we ended up MRI scanning 1,000 joints of volunteers over the last 5 years who have done various amounts of exercise. Most of them had run marathons. The papers have written about the work that we published, including about some cycling work. And Sophie Rayworth has a column in Runner's World, and she wrote about the work in January or February this year. She was a great sport. That's actually her outside our MRI scanner. She took part in one of our studies, which gave her the insight to write about it. Well, many of you know designing exercise studies is difficult because there are so many variables involved. There are so many different types of people, so many different types of sport, so many different ways they do sport. Well, our running studies involve looking at the spine, the hip, and the knee. Healthy midlifers were who we concentrated on, and a varying dose, most of them marathon runners, some of them ultra-marathon runners, and then, as I mentioned earlier, some of them were actually couch potatoes. To address the variable issue, we used a longitudinal design, a bit like the last speaker, and did MRI scanning before and afterwards. In fact, we did it before they started a standardized marathon training program, which lasts 16 weeks, and then after the marathon. So most of what you're about to see compares not just the marathon, but it compares before and after the marathon training program and a marathon. And we used quantitative outcome measures. I'll come on to that. Dual reporting, 2 senior musculoskeletal radiologists blinded. So let's start with the knee study. These were the questions that we asked ourselves. How common were abnormalities in the knee of a midlifer? What happened to these midlife abnormalities when they did a marathon training program and ran a marathon? And did their knee symptoms get worse after a marathon? Well, largest imaging study of marathon runners. Very grateful to the London Marathon for allowing us to do the study. They sent out 5,000 emails to registrants to enable us to then filter our volunteers. And they had no idea what we were going to find. I had no idea what I was going to find. I sort of thought that after hobbling around for 2 weeks that we were going to find a lot of bad stuff, particularly as we were using 3 Tesla MRI. That's the highest resolution MRI. And also they were being scrutinized by 2 musculoskeletal radiologists who spend their whole life looking for abnormalities in the knee, hip, and spine. About 500 knees were scanned in total for this study. What do we find? Well, virtually everybody had an abnormality. Age between 30 and 50, if you are, you will have an abnormality, most likely. 90% of you will have abnormalities. A third of you will have meniscal tears. We used to operate on almost all meniscal tears in the past. Ligament injuries, tendon injuries, basically lots of abnormalities. And remember, we didn't design the intervention of marathon running. These people were registered and entered a marathon. We didn't say, please run a marathon on your bucket handle tear of the medial meniscus, on your cartilage surface damage to the medial femoral condyle, just for liability coverage. I mean, the ethics side of this is pretty interesting, but you have to think of all the medical aspects. So, 3 main findings. So, first one, what happens to the bone? Well, actually, it improved. I'll tell you more about that shortly. The kneecap, well, actually, in some cases, the kneecap did actually suffer. Asymptomatic, there were 3 cases that did have some bone marrow edema, but that did reverse within 6 months in 2 of them. On all those pre-existing abnormalities, none of them got worse. Let's take you through those findings in a bit more detail. Bone marrow edema, possibly a pre-arthritic finding, a lot of unknowns, but the bottom line is, in 9 cases, the bone marrow edema improved. So here are 3 examples: before the marathon, after the marathon, gone. After the marathon, the medial femoral condyle and medial tibial plateau, medial tibial condyle, bone marrow edema, gone. Same for the last one, gone. Importantly, no new cases of bone marrow edema were found. The kneecap changes, well, 3 did have some high signal in the kneecap after the marathon. In 2 of these actually resolved back to normal 6 months afterwards. The abnormalities that I mentioned, so bucket handle tear of the medial meniscus, he got less than 4 hours on his bucket handle tear of the medial meniscus, and it didn't change on imaging appearance. Lateral meniscal tear, no change between the pre and the post. So, what have I shown you about the knees of marathon runners? Well, virtually all midlifers have abnormalities in their knee, and these include cartilage, bone, menisci, tendons, ligaments. Following the marathon, these abnormalities did not worsen. And in some people, the knees actually improved. You can read the study, it's open access, all of this work's available at exerciseforscience.org, and it's free. The hip study. So, what did we do here? Well, we asked 3 questions. Guess what they are? How common are abnormalities in the hips of midlife people who want to run a marathon? If they ran a marathon, what would happen to them? And do their hip symptoms change when they run a marathon? This was the Richmond Runfest marathon this time. Very similar design to the knee study. 28 participants, 56 hips scanned 2 time points, over 100 MRI scans. Again, midlifers and first-time marathon runners. As with the previous study, first-time marathon runners. We looked at all of the structures: cartilage, bone marrow, ligaments, tendon, muscles, labrum, everything. What did we find? Did we find abnormalities? Well, yes, virtually every person had an abnormality on 3T MRI scanning. So labral tears, bone marrow edema, cysts, articular cartilage defects, tendinosis. And what happened to these? Well, they did not progress after the marathon. Give you a few examples. Full thickness cartilage acetabular defect. Any change after the marathon? No change. Labral cartilage separation. Any change after the marathon? No change. Psoas tendinosis. Any change after the marathon? No change. Hamstring tendinosis. No change. Hip symptoms, or hip function and hip symptoms were not altered. So what have I shown you about the hips of marathon runners? Well, almost everybody has an abnormality and they don't get worse. And the hip function doesn't worsen after running a marathon. And that's, in fact, that study is, it turns out that the findings of abnormalities in midlife marathon runners, midlife would-be marathon runners, is really rather useful data. So this was published separately, and it totally changes how we look at people who present to us, patients who present to us with hip pain and abnormalities on their MRI scan. Spine study. Any abnormalities in a midlife spine? First question. What happened to the abnormalities after marathon running? Second question. What happened to their spine symptoms after? It's pretty simple stuff, isn't it? I'm not going to go through everything just like the last one because I think you've got the gist of it. So, but you know, each time we did one of these studies, I was just amazed that people weren't falling apart on 3D MRI scanning. And basically, we started thinking that actually running a marathon is not bad for your joints. So we then started thinking, well, how can we better use the data that we've been collecting? Well, we then got into looking at joint health, and in particular muscle health, and then in particular how muscle health can help our joints. So we then got a bit carried away tracing around all of the outlines of all of the muscles, of all of the MRI scans, of all of the people that we involved in our studies. And eventually we came up with an automated method of doing this. So machine learning initially, and then an AI-driven method of telling us the muscle outlines and then putting it together in 3 dimensions. And with specialized scanning protocols, we can then measure not just 3D muscle volume, but we can measure fat fraction in each individual muscle. Well, this opens up a massive world now. Proper quantitative MRI, proper potential biomarkers for muscle health that's non-invasive, and we can start looking at runners, everybody we can start looking at and trying to understand what's going on with their muscles. So, just to give you a few facts, fat fraction, gluteus maximus, this is actually one slice I'm showing you, but the figures, the percentage is actually taken over the whole 3D volume of the muscle. So marathon runner, around 12% in their gluteus maximus. Patient about to have hip replacement, around 40%. We've done studies on people with varying levels of physical activity. So that includes people with hip pain, our couch potatoes, our cyclists, and our runners. And we're now progressing to the core. So we can now measure 3D muscle volume and fat fraction of psoas, quadratus lumborum, erector spinae, iliacus. And there's just so much stuff to do now on exercise and activity, ways to measure their muscles properly, ways to measure their response to robotic rehab and how the muscles control their rehab So we've got a lot to do. What have I shown you? Well, I've shown you how orthopaedic surgeons view activity and physical inactivity. I've told you how I got involved in this. What happens to your body as you exercise, some of what other authors have written about, and the published evidence mainly from us on the spine, hip and knee, what happens to these joints when you run a marathon, a bit about the future, and hopefully you now understand that exercise damages joints is a misbelief, and we're working on changing everybody's view of arthritis, not labeling it wear and tear arthritis. And if you are a runner, the place to start is the Couch to 5K app, the NHS downloadable app, something like 6 million downloads. That's also supported by the BBC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is this working? No? Hello? Yes. Any questions for Alister? Oh, there's lots to choose from here. Let's go there.
I wondered whether the findings from all these MRI scans with 90% of people reported having free, has it changed your surgical practice?
Yes, so in particular around the hip, because a third of our volunteers had labral tears. So I'll give you one example, labral tears. A third had labral tears. And they ran a marathon with their labral tear. The symptoms didn't change, and the labral tear didn't change on MRI. So when I see a patient who has hip pain and a labral tear on MRI, I warn them away from hip arthroscopy. I encourage them to look at all the other potential generators of pain around their hip, generally send them for hip strengthening of all of their hip muscles and hip muscle coordination, and look for everything non-surgical that we can do for people, because if you can run a marathon on what they have, then is it really the cause of their pain? We've got enough people to do hip surgery on in the country, by the way, so that's not a reason to offer them hip surgery, but offering the right people the right operation is obviously important.
Can I just be selfish and ask a question? You said I think it was for the hips and the knees, about 90% had pre-existing issues when they came to your studies. How reflective is that of the wider running population? Can we expect that with any runners, or was it specific to your cohort, do you think?
So those figures came from first-time marathon runners. They'd all done less than 1 hour of exercise a week. This was before they started the marathon training program. So basically, you're talking about actually not very active people. Right. I mean, if our physical activity guidelines are for 5 hours of exercise a week plus 2 resistance training sessions, then the people recruited for these studies were well below the recommended level of exercise. The knee, our data on the knee, that's been replicated elsewhere. The data on the hip hasn't been so clearly replicated as in our study.
So the prevalence in the general population, do you think, would be similar to that 90%?
Very.
I'm going to get another question, but if I can just repeat the question just for the sound before Alister answers, that would be good. So the question is, even if the radiological changes haven't occurred, did symptoms or other things perhaps change between pre to post marathon training and running?
So the simple answer is they didn't have symptoms, and the symptoms didn't change. In other words, they remained asymptomatic. And that was quantified in various ways. So the Coos score and the Who's score are well-established medical functional outcome measures for knee and hip. The recruits we had a medical questionnaire. They had to be healthy individuals, no previous joint damage or joint injury, for example, and asymptomatic according to the Coos or the Who's scores. Those stand for hip outcome something score.
That's a good one. Okay, question here.
I know everyone's very interested in running, but the question, because running's very open, so ligaments can move in an open way. But how about like a sport like cycling, where you're kind of stuck on the bike, and the position on the bike makes quite a big difference on how you're moving? Would you expect similar results, or?
So there's no exercise type that is the best to do, the most optimal. You get different things from different type of exercise. So one of the things that you get in bucket loads from running is impact on your bones and building the health of your bones. One of the things you get in bucket loads from cycling is the closed chain nature of the exercise and the coordination of the muscles. So I'm a great fan of cycling, and we have done some cycling studies too. But one of the things you also don't get from cycling is working your hip abductor muscles. So you do one of those, gluteus maximus is a hip abductor, but muscles such as gluteus medius and minimus, you don't work in cycling nearly as much as you do with running. So a mix of exercise.
Thank you very much. We'll do one more question. Gentleman over here.
From your perspective, from the perspective of kind of orthopaedic consultants, what's the kind of general consensus on return to running sort of post during arthritis?
Yeah, a really good question. So we've got funding for running with implants, and that's hips and knees, ankles, any implants. This is not people with implants, we want you to run a marathon. These people are doing it anyway. So tomorrow in the London Marathon, there will be people running with hip replacements. I'm guessing there will be with knee replacements. Do we recommend it? Is really your question. So there was a great survey of 150 European hip surgeons, and the consensus was, at what time after hip replacement would you allow your patient to run 10K? Answer, 6 months. It's not nearly as simple for knees, but certainly, and that consensus is their opinion. It's not an imaging-based or really evidence-based. It's an interview-based opinion. But generally, hip replacement, you can return certainly at 1 year to virtually everything. And in terms of running, 10K at 6 months. Yeah. I'll hopefully give you the answer at some stage about running a marathon on hip replacement.
So the question, sorry, just to repeat the question, is has your work changed the way you treat acute injuries compared to what you would have done in the past?
I mean, to be fair, we haven't looked at that. It's really hard to look at that. I did mention the issues around ethics briefly, because you can't make people run a marathon, especially if they have an injury, because you're going to get yourself in trouble. And if they're going to do it anyway, then actually you're being quite responsible in saying, well, let's see actually what happens to you. But you don't really want to encourage people with injuries to do what is really a very demanding thing. So what's important ethically is that you have the medical backup to deal with incidental findings. Just that's the main ethical issue. And the other point to say is, I think the biggest thing I've learned is easing people into running is what the marathon training program does, a 16-week marathon training program, and all these people followed the standardized training program. So easing into it probably is the answer to some of your question. And that's what the Couch to 5K app does in particular.
Great. Thanks very much, Alister. I'm sure there's more questions, but we're going to keep on time and move on. But round of applause, and we'll move on to the next